Hi folks, it's time for the first deep dive on this channel. Shostakovich continues to be one of the most popular composers from the 20th century. His music is emotive and powerful, with lots of room for multiple interpretations. Just as moving as his music is his biography. He suffered dreadfully on the whims of the Soviet government and cultural authorities. There exists a very widespread version of Shostakovich, commonly held to be true, that he was a secret protester, hiding messages in his music. According to this view, Soviet authorities did not hear such protests at the time, because they were stupid, but modern-day audiences can detect them now and feel clever about themselves. Categorically, as a musicologist and a music historian, there is no evidence for this. In this video, I'm going to give an overview of the facts on Shostakovich, the publication of a very problematic book, and the Shostakovich Wars that raged as a result, and where we are now. Buckle in.
Look in my eyes, what do you see? A cult of musicology.
My name's Dr. Dan Elphig. Between my PhD in Russian music, my publications on Shostakovich and Russian music, my public lectures on Shostakovich and Russian music, I humbly, modestly feel qualified to share a few snippets from my own research area on this channel. So what's the backstory here? In the mid-1930s, Shostakovich was on his way to becoming one of the most popular composers in the world. His opera Lady Macbeth was an international success. In January 1936, this newspaper review was released, threatening Shostakovich that he was playing a game that may end very badly, that Lady Macbeth was full of inappropriate music. Overnight, Shostakovich's performances were cancelled and he struggled to make a living. In other words, the Soviet government made an example of him, for other composers to see that the cultural authorities could just as easily take away prestige and success as they could choose to bestow it. Many of Shostakovich's works following this tread a fine line between tolerating the Soviet authorities or perhaps having a tone that seemed to poke fun or criticize them. In many cases, we actually just don't know, because the composer was very hesitant to ever go on record. This, to me, is the endlessly fascinating beauty of Shostakovich's music. It is flexible in terms of its meaning. Suggestions of stories or emotions behind the music are multivalent. We can choose to identify lots of different meanings or intentions. This fact is problematized as soon as any one person says they know the intention for sure. As I said, Shostakovich's success is arguably a result of the flexible, multiple meanings we can identify in his music. In particular, lots of people have tried to say that, time and time again, Shostakovich hid or smuggled messages into his music that were critical of communism and the Soviet Union. I'm going to be clear. Some of Shostakovich's music really does do this, actually. When he chooses to do this, it's not subtle at all, though. In fact, it's blindingly obvious. Take, for instance, his 13th Symphony from 1962. This choral symphony, set to words by Yevgeny Yevtushenko, is highly critical of Stalinist-era Russia, from food shortages and queues outside shops, the outright fear experienced by many during the terror, and in the first movement, condemnation of the lack of Holocaust commemoration in the Soviet Union. It's as subtle as a brick. Crucially, it's from 1962, that's 9 years after Stalin's death. Shostakovich was certainly critical here, but he wasn't hiding anything. Another example, a work only publicly heard after Shostakovich's death, his Anti-Formalist Rayok. This was a work for piano and singer that made fun of the cultural reforms started after the Second World War in the Soviet Union. It includes direct quotes from politicians and parodies some of Stalin's favourite songs. We don't know a lot about the work, other than that it was probably for private performance among close friends. Shostakovich didn't intend it for public performance during his lifetime, but In common with the 13th Symphony, he wasn't subtle when criticising these high-profile figures. And what's the opposite extreme to that then? Well, Shostakovich knew when to appease and to suck up to the Soviet government too. After that same post-war crackdown, he wrote lots of high-profile propaganda works, the most famous of which is called Song of the Forests. Those who want to see Shostakovich as anti-Soviet have argued that Shostakovich was forced to write this piece. But, as musicologist Marina Frolova-Walker has demonstrated, Shostakovich actually began work on this piece after he had already been rehabilitated, so we can't just view it as a piece to try and win his reputation back. Alright, why am I drawing out these examples? Because there is a stark difference of opinion in Shostakovich. On one side, we have those who wish to see him as the secret protester, hiding messages in his music. On the other, we have those who say that, more realistically, Shostakovich was someone who got by during the Soviet era, having suffered greatly at different times, that he was at best indifferent to the Soviet Union, and even at times praised it openly. How did this divide come about? Well, here's when things get really musicological. As with so many things, it begins with a book. In 1979, after Shostakovich's death, a book is published in New York, Testimony, the memoirs of Shostakovich, as related to and edited by Solomon Volkov. In this text, written in first person from Shostakovich's perspective, we encounter a bitter old man who hated both the Soviet regime and also many of his peers, from Stravinsky to Prokofiev. This was still during the Cold War. In America and Western Europe, it was slightly unfashionable to enjoy Shostakovich's music at this point. But Testimony offered a new perspective. If Shostakovich was secretly anti-communist, that made him one of the good guys, and freedom-loving capitalist listeners could enjoy his music again. Testimony became a bestseller. But all was not right with Testimony. Here beginneth the Shostakovich Wars. In 1980, musicologist Laurel E. Fay smelled a rat. In the introduction to Testimony, Volkov sets out how he wrote the book. He met with and interviewed Shostakovich several times in the early 1970s and kept detailed notes. After the meetings, Volkov assembled these notes into a coherent text. Fay noticed a glaringly strange fact of the book, that the first chunk of every new chapter was identical, almost word for word, to articles and texts that Shostakovich had already published during his lifetime. Her 1980 article, Shostakovich versus Volkov, whose Testimony, documented these verbatim extracts, but it didn't receive a great amount of attention. Shortly thereafter, Shostakovich's widow, Irina Shostakovich, condemned the book. She claimed that Volkov had met with her husband only a handful of times, speaking for barely a few hours. That's certainly not enough time to interview someone for enough material for a memoir. Along with this, 6 of Shostakovich's closest friends signed a public letter saying that the book was not by Shostakovich. So you might think that that was enough evidence to throw Testimony out of the window, but no sir. 2 figures, Alan B. Ho and Dmitri Feofanov, published a near 800-page defense of Volkov and Testimony in their 1998 book, Shostakovich Reconsidered. Here, they gave ad hominem attacks criticizing the allegiances of Fay and other Western scholars of Soviet music and insulting Shostakovich's surviving family, while supporting Volkov. Crucially, they didn't give any solid refutations of the problems that Fay highlighted. Shostakovich Reconsidered presents things in a kind of legal structure, but doesn't really present a solid academic argument. Where does that leave us? Well, the public image of Shostakovich was changing rapidly at this point. More and more figures, performers, conductors, music critics, read Testimony and changed their perspective on Shostakovich. Despite Fay and others' protests, the popular view of the composer changed. Another famous book was Ian MacDonald's The New Shostakovich, which dismissed criticisms of testimony and argued that the best evidence in support of Shostakovich as dissident was the music itself. MacDonald passionately argued that Shostakovich's musical meanings were obvious. Here's one quote on the Fifth Symphony. "A startling cinematic cut sends us tumbling out of the world of abstraction and into representation of the most coarsely literal kind. We are at a political rally, the leader making his entrance through the audience like a boxer flanked by a phalanx of thugs. This passage, the menace theme dissonantly harmonised on grotesquely smirking low trumpets to the two-note goose step of timpani, tuba and double bass, is a shocking intrusion of cartoon satire. Given the time and place in which it was written, the target can only be Stalin, an amazingly bold stroke." What? It's one thing for an author to say they like to hear this nice story in the music, but it's another thing to say that this is the story of the music. There is categorically no reason to suggest that this is what Shostakovich actually meant. It's entirely the product of MacDonald's mind. To paint it as fact is absurd. In 1933, Shostakovich wrote about his feelings on exactly this scenario when someone writes that they know the exact meaning of one of his pieces. When a critic writes that in such and such a symphony, Soviet civil servants are represented by the oboe and clarinet and Red Army soldiers by a group of brass instruments, it makes you want to scream. It's not so. Okay, so where are we by this point? The pro-Volkov side have resorted to crude imagery and ad hominem attacks. What are the academics doing? Well, Laurel E. Fay and others, especially Malcolm Hamrick Brown, have regrouped and they bring out a Shostakovich casebook in 2004. To be clear, this text is a slap in the face for anyone still wanting testimony to be true. Laurel Fay isn't a scholar to be dismissed lightly. In a new article, Volkov's Testimony Reconsidered, Fay dropped a new bombshell. Fay had acquired a copy of the original Russian manuscript. Testimony had never been published in Russian, but only in English translation. All Volkov's claims to authenticity rested on the original manuscript, and in particular, that Shostakovich himself had read and approved the manuscript. The manuscript that Fay had did indeed feature Shostakovich's signature, but only on the pages where Shostakovich's words were identical to previously published sources. And in the manuscript, as soon as you turn over the page, the angry, bitter tone of the rest of the book creeps back in. In other words, there was no reliable claim to authenticity. Volkov and Ho and Feofanov tried to claim that Shostakovich just had perfect memory, that he recited these articles word for word, and that Volkov, in his own note-taking system, copied them down word for word and reassembled them word for word. It's absurd beyond the point of believability. Testimony's claims to authenticity were thrown out of the window for good, though that didn't stop Feofanov and Ho writing a follow-up book called the Shostakovich Wars. This self-published book sought to discredit the Moscow manuscript that Fay worked with, but then later resorts to ad hominem attacks again, this time against Irina Shostakovich and prominent musicologist Richard Taruskin. It even features unfounded claims of censorship against the American Musicological Society and other publications, even though Feofanov and Ho's writings have been widely circulated. Suffice to say, this last publication hasn't been well received. Where does that leave us today? Some scholars and musicians still argue that testimony is perhaps useful as a kind of portrait of Shostakovich. Among them, Shostakovich's son, Maxim. Well, if it is just a portrait, we shouldn't be treating it like it's actually Shostakovich's own words, or as a historically accurate source. In an academic sense, we shouldn't be quoting from testimony unless we can also back it up with support from another, more reliable source. In which case, why quote from testimony at all? We should treat it like Anton Schindler's problematic biography of Beethoven, or wouldn't it be nice the coerced or forged Brian Wilson autobiography. All of this means, in an academic sense, that the portrait of Shostakovich as the secret protester relies on flimsy evidence and speculation. The picture that has recently emerged is more complex, a composer who knew when to keep his head down, but also when to praise the regime as it suited him. I'd strongly recommend Pauline Fairclough's recent book for anyone interested in a thorough but impartial biography. But wait, where does that leave the Shostakovich Wars? Are they over? Well, yes. After a Shostakovich casebook was published, it's very difficult to accept anything from testimony as authentic. But that doesn't mean the Shostakovich's secret protester story has gone away. In fact, it's everywhere. As an academic, I'm tired of challenging this story every time I hear it, but it is 100% factually accurate to say that there is little to no clear evidence that Shostakovich wanted to secretly protest. If you want to believe that, great, but you have to accept that, at present, there is almost no factually reliable evidence to support that view. What we are left with is a composer whose music offers multiple interpretations and layers of meaning. It's a fantastically rich body of work that rewards multiple listens. That's why I and so many others love it. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'd enjoy reading Laurel Fay's work, and I'd like you to challenge everyone you hear say that Shostakovich hated the Soviet Union and secretly protested against it in his music. It's nonsense, and it's reductive. His music is so much more complex than that, and again, that's why I love it. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video, folks. Please like, share and subscribe. Comment with any suggestions or anything you'd like to see in future videos. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Look in my eyes, what do you see? A cult of music